Hi everyone, welcome. Some of you might recognize the system already over here with the fast food chain restaurant bag on it. It's our mixed bin of worms, and the system, believe it or not, is almost 3 weeks away from its 1 year of being in service. I mean, yesterday was the day from which it was going to be 3 weeks exactly until the system reaches 1 year old. Today it's 20 days from reaching 365 days old. So far we've been into the system 28 times to feed, and today's feeding comes after 13 days since the last one. And this feeding is going to be a little bit different, I believe, because we're going to now, I believe, transition the system from just your everyday composting. We even made note of the fact that this system was unusual in the way that it was gaining such a high age as far as the number of days it's been in service, the number of feedings it's received, especially considering the smaller scale or smaller size of container that it runs in. So we didn't always actually even run these worms in this container. They ran in a smaller container until the meager, puny population that we started out with originally grew to a size that we felt was big enough to deserve a slightly larger place to live. And that's when we moved these little guys into this box here. Well, it's really two boxes, one inside the other. And they've really done a great job bouncing back, increasing their numbers from just a few handful to many hundred, I believe. And it was when we transitioned from the small box to this box, when we moved them into these larger accommodations, we decided that we would take all the material that had been placed inside of the old environment that they lived in inside the smaller container and put it on one side, and then start managing only the opposite side as the place where routine feedings would be placed, and always leaving the opposite end of the system to be where the most heavily worked and most mature material would be stored. So this system's been dealing with a fairly large number of springtails that have moved in here quite a long time ago at this point. I don't remember how long it's been now that we've been sort of just dealing with the presence of springtails all over the place. You can see them. They're the little tiny white speckles mixed in amongst the material over here. And sort of like the worms, they have a tendency to want to dive down out of the bright lights and retreat out of view. So I've definitely allowed maybe 3 or 4 minutes at this point. I wasn't really keeping track, just to allow, an opportunity for these little critters to just dive right down beneath the surface to get out of view again. So sort of the same way we're seeing a lot of activity on this edge of the bin where the feedings have been getting applied. If we were to make our way across, we would start getting into older and older material which has not been getting fed regularly, has not even been maintained from the perspective of applying any moisture there. It's just been kind of left to kind of mature and continue to break down at its own pace just from sitting out here in the bin. But you can see right away in terms of just any sort of creatures even populating the material, there's very few out here. People will sometimes run these systems and consider them as sort of a continuous flow system where the flow of the material goes in this direction, where the most fresh bedding and food is all placed onto the sort of the working end on this side where the worms and the activity is. And every time you come in to put in more after an interval between feedings, you would continue to shove the older, more processed material off into the opposite direction to make room for the replenishment of bedding and foods. And then eventually this material out here starts to have less and less interest to the worms because of the depletion of the food, the depletion of the moisture. And eventually it just gets to the point where you can reach in and grab a handful of castings whenever you need some. The only thing I think that's been preventing me from doing that in here so far has been the springtails. Otherwise, a lot of this casting material might have already been used out in my garden. And I believe that I want to do that soon, you know. Even if it's got springtails in it at this point, I don't really think that's going to be a huge problem if I were to just take this stuff out and start applying it to the base of my plants outside. The springtails that live in this stuff would probably fall prey to being, you know, like the delicious meal to a whole bunch of other critters that live out in my garden. That's kind of what I assume would happen to the springtails that live in this material. And then the castings themselves would end up providing a really nice meal to my plants. So the feeding that I was going to give them today was one that wouldn't really even be all that different from any other feeding in this system, just because it would always be getting put on that far edge. But in a way, I did want to sort of treat this next feeding as almost like the initiation of the worms out of the material that they inhabit. So it does seem kind of weird to just come in here and apply yet another feeding in the typical way you would in a continuous flow type or wedge sort of shaped system like this one. But to consider it something other than a routine feeding seems a little bit weird. So I did feel like I wanted to at some point establish some sort of a official line of delineation within this material that would say, you know, hey, from this point on everything is definitely finished castings, and then perhaps some other section of it, some sort of middle section between that and the active feeding area would become a section that I would feel could still use a little bit more time, so might not get scooped out right away, but I would like to try to treat some future point in time, perhaps when the system reaches 1 year of age. Maybe we'll save that for that point in time, 20 days from now, to come in here and actually do sort of a harvest on the castings out of this continuous flow system, out of this wedge. Because even though we've been running it configured this way for all these months, we have never harvested castings from it, and theoretically that's the whole idea for running a system configured this way, with all the activity focused on one end and then the finished castings being on the opposite end. The idea is that eventually you would just begin scooping out material and making use of it, and then eventually, you know, opening up space within the bin to permit, you know, room for fresh bedding to get placed in, some fresh foods. And I think that's kind of going to be my aim for 20 days from now. Perhaps we'll even come back in one more time between now and the first haul out of castings. Maybe it'll be just another sort of replenishment feeding over in the feeding zone that we'll do before now and the haul out of castings. But it does seem to me, just the way I've stacked it all up here, that the material that's all very much still in progress, with bedding mixed in it, leftover foods, a lot of worm activity, a good bit of moisture, is accounting for probably nearly half of what's in the container now. And then obviously what we put in now is going to be very, very fresh, brand newly added stuff. So I'm just gradually nudging things over, which is just the way you would do it if you decided to run a system this way. Most of my systems are not run this way. Most of my systems have sort of a defined end where the entire system would have all the worms sort of lured out of it and hauled out, leaving behind only their castings. But I have thought about maybe keeping this system around for an extended period of time as a regular wedge or, you know, continuous flow style setup, and then actually do what you would normally do in such a system, is actually start pulling castings out once in a while to put them to use. So I don't know, I was just debating on how to classify this system in my book. I am definitely like sort of on the fence in terms of, do I want to even consider this as a system that's, you know, in the process of me trying to migrate the worms out of this stuff? Do I transition to what I consider to be migration? Or do I just consider this as a different type of system in which migration is just basically what the worms are doing all the time, and there's no need to consider that as a life cycle phase? It's just what the worms are doing anyway all the time, and then at some point we'll simply be scooping castings out. I don't know. Perhaps it doesn't really make sense to consider this as migrating, since the worms are sort of just ever migrating in a system like this. So whatever, we've got a pretty nice little assortment of stuff here, and as you can see, the little puddle on the bottom of the container is indicating what's happening to this stuff as it thaws out, especially the cucumbers. The cucumbers, when you take them out of the freezer, really do start dropping a lot of their moisture out of their themselves, out of their material, basically, you know. And the whole idea that I had for today's feeding was to try to deliver it with let's see, how did I want to do this? I got it right over here set up. So I've got these little cardboard tubes that I thought we could jam the food into, but before just jamming the food straight into one of these, I figured maybe we would even bundle it a little bit. So take a piece of newspaper into which one of these little delicious food morsels would go, but before jamming it down inside one of these tubes, we would sort of further wrap it so that it would become a little bit of a challenge for the worms to actually gain access to the delicious food tucked away within this assortment of different bedding type materials that surround the food item. So I didn't really imagine it taking that long to stuff and pack and prepare one of these things, but there we go. We got one of them is done already. And we've got, let's see, these are pretty thin, so I think I'll put 2 into each of these bundles, and since it's a somewhat smaller package, I believe, we'll put those into these shorter ones. I got, how much? 2 shorter ones and 3 longer ones, or here's the 2 shorter ones, I believe. Let's do the banana and the shorter ones. Let's do the cucumber and the longer ones. All right, so let's get this delicious feeding wrapped up as discussed, and then we can start backfilling and covering up. Alright, and I guess these paper towels that I bought down, I'm going to let those sop up all that delicious cucumber juice at the bottom of the container there, so that we can use that in the feeding too. I thought that those pieces of paper towel would sort of be boring with no real food associated to them directly, but by being soaked in cucumber juice, I think that's going to change the game considerably, making those pieces of paper towel very popular items over here in the bin. So, kind of an unusual setup for the feeding. I'm even wondering if perhaps resting them on their side would get them a little bit lower down in the bin, giving me a greater opportunity to actually cover the feeding zone up and make it less appealing to any sort of possible passerby, flying insects, or anything that might catch a whiff of the yummy goodness that we just stuck in there. And I guess these paper towels are doing what they're advertised to do. They sucked up pretty much all the moisture that was in this thing, so that's a pretty good deal. And there were 2 of them here. So let's try to spread them out evenly across the entire setup. So even though the newspaper jammed inside the dry tubes is dry, as the tubes are dry too, the tubes are now covered with fairly damp material, and even inside the tubes is some pretty damp material wrapped up in some paper. So I think that's it. We're just going to very, lightly cover the feeding zone using some of this material that we excavated from over there, what had been the old feeding zone material, and now I think we've got sort of 3 distinct sections of the bin, and it does seem to me like the most mature material in the bin is such that we could probably begin just scooping it out at any time. So I believe maybe that's how we'll celebrate the system's 100th day in service. Do we wait 20 days till the next check-in? Will it be necessary to come back in and see how these little guys are doing? I don't know. it does feel to me almost like we could probably let them go another 20 days before checking in. I mean, after all, it was 17 days between the last check-in and now. And they seem to be doing all right. If we were to add another week, then Sun tells me they would be all right. But who knows? We'll just have to play it by ear and see how it goes. So that's it, our check-in on the mixed red worms. Pretty cool little system. 20 days away from hitting 1 year of age. Presently enjoying its 29th feeding. And still springtails, but somehow maybe not as many. What do you think? I'm curious to see what people think. If you've been following along, you know what I'm talking about. The system's been very heavily populated with springtails, but it does seem like maybe their numbers are dropping. But maybe I'm just imagining. Alright everyone, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Take care.